In the quiet streets of Portland, the morning fog lingered like a soft veil over the old houses. Henry Miller, an 82-year-old retired schoolteacher, sat by the window of his modest apartment, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. His hands trembled slightly, not from age alone, but from the emptiness that seemed to weigh on his chest. Henry had lived in Portland for most of his life, raising a family, shaping young minds, and finding joy in the simple routines of life. But time had a cruel way of changing everything. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years ago, leaving a void that no amount of conversation or distraction could fill. His children, now scattered across different states, called occasionally, but those voices over the phone could never replace the warmth of a shared meal or the comfort of someone sitting quietly beside him. He looked around the apartment, walls adorned with faded photographs, shelves holding memories of a life once full of laughter. The ticking clock on the wall was louder than ever today. Each tick seemed to echo his solitude, reminding him that he was living in a world where the days passed without someone truly noticing. Henry tried to fill the silence with the hum of the radio, but the voices from the speakers felt distant, almost alien. He often found himself talking to the air, reading books aloud, or tending to the plants that crowded the windowsill, their green leaves a small rebellion against the grayness around him. Yet at the end of every day, the silence returned, heavier than before. The loneliness was not just a companion, it was a shadow, stretching long and cold across every corner of his life. And today, as the fog pressed against the window, Henry felt it pressing against his heart too. One afternoon, Henry received a letter that made the world he had carefully constructed around his loneliness tremble. It was from the bank. The words were polite yet cold. His savings had dwindled faster than he expected, and with rising medical bills, his modest pension could no longer cover his apartment rent and daily expenses. Henry sank into his favorite armchair, the letter trembling in his hands. He had always prided himself on being independent, never asking for help, never burdening anyone. Yet now, reality pressed upon him like the heavy fog outside his window. Bills, doctor visits, groceries, things that once felt manageable now seemed impossible. The thought of leaving his apartment, the home that held so many memories, made him feel like he was losing not just his security, but pieces of himself. As days passed, the pressure mounted. Henry began skipping meals, avoiding calls, and withdrawing even more from the few friends he still had. Each phone call from a distant relative felt like a reminder of how far apart their lives had grown. He couldn't help but feel forgotten, invisible in a society that celebrated youth and independence, leaving older souls like him to quietly vanish into the background. The loneliness he had lived with for years now wore a sharper edge. Fear and anxiety crept into his mornings, making it harder to get out of bed. The once familiar hum of Portland's streets outside now seemed distant, almost mocking. The world moved on, and Henry felt stuck, trapped inside a life that was slowly tightening around him. He realized that his grief for Margaret was no longer just emotional. It was becoming a burden that threatened to consume his entire life. And yet he felt powerless to do anything about it. Days blurred into nights, and Henry's world grew colder. The apartment, once a sanctuary filled with memories, now felt like a cage. The bills piled up, and the persistent ache of loneliness gnawed at him. Small tasks became mountains: getting out of bed, making a meal, even opening the mail. The city outside buzzed with life, yet Henry felt as though he were watching it through a thick glass, separated, removed, unseen. One rainy evening, the lights flickered, and Henry realized he had forgotten to pay the electricity bill. Darkness swallowed the room, except for the weak glow of the streetlights outside. He fumbled for his coat, hoping to walk to the bank or a neighbor for help, but the effort felt overwhelming. The fear of asking for assistance, of admitting he could no longer manage, weighed heavily on him. Pride, which had once been a quiet comfort, had become a chain. Henry's health, too, began to falter. The arthritis in his hands made simple chores painful, and bouts of dizziness came without warning. Once confident in his body and mind, he now doubted both. Sleep offered little relief. Nightmares of being alone, forgotten, and abandoned haunted him. Each night he wept silently, tears soaking the pillow, mourning not only his wife, but the life he thought he could sustain on his own. Even his once beloved routines began to crumble. The radio, the books, the plants, all reminders of normalcy, felt empty, echoes of a life slipping through his fingers. And with every passing day, the fear grew. What if he became too weak, too forgotten, too insignificant to matter? The conflict that had been simmering now burned fiercely. Henry's isolation, financial strain, and declining health intertwined into a suffocating web. The quiet grief that once accompanied his days had transformed into something heavier, something that threatened to extinguish the light he still carried inside. It was a gray, drizzling afternoon when Henry reached a point he never imagined. His apartment, dim and cold, felt unbearably heavy. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floorboards, his body aching and his spirit even more so. The letter from the utility company lay unopened on the table, a silent threat that seemed to mirror the emptiness inside him. Days of skipped meals had left him weak, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. His mind, once sharp from years of teaching, now faltered over simple thoughts. He couldn't remember whether he had taken his medication, and the isolation gnawed at him relentlessly. For the first time in his life, Henry felt truly helpless. He thought of Margaret, of her warm laughter and comforting presence, how he had once leaned on her in ways he now realized he could never replace. Grief, he understood, didn't fade, it only lingered, sometimes quietly, sometimes like a storm that knocks you off your feet. And now that storm had arrived. Henry's pride had kept him from reaching out, from admitting the depth of his struggle. But as he sat there, shivering and exhausted, he felt the crushing weight of solitude and fear. The city outside moved on, umbrellas bobbing through the rain, cars splashing puddles on the streets, lives continuing without him. Henry realized he had been surviving, but not living. In that moment, with tears silently tracing paths down his worn cheeks, he felt the full weight of his vulnerability. The grief, the loneliness, the fear, they had converged, leaving him at a crossroads. Continue fading quietly, or find a spark, however small, to reach back toward life. The next morning, a soft knock echoed through Henry's apartment. Startled, he shuffled to the door and found Mrs. Alvarez, his neighbor from down hall, holding a basket of fresh bread and fruit. "Morning, Henry," she said gently. "I thought you might like some company and something to eat." Henry hesitated, pride and embarrassment warring within him. But the warmth in her eyes, the quiet kindness, stirred something dormant inside him. For the first time in weeks, he felt a faint pulse of connection, a reminder that he was not entirely invisible. Over the next few days, small gestures began to break through the wall he had built around himself. Mrs. Alvarez checked in regularly, helping with groceries, or simply sharing a cup of tea while listening. A phone call from his daughter came one evening, more insistent this time, encouraging him to see a doctor about his health and the bills. Slowly, Henry began to realize that seeking help wasn't weakness, it was survival. It was a revelation that carried both relief and fear. Relief because he no longer had to carry everything alone. fear because it meant confronting the reality he had long avoided. Yet, for the first time, Henry felt a flicker of hope. Maybe life hadn't abandoned him entirely. Maybe he could still find small joys, small victories, even in the shadow of grief. He allowed himself to smile that evening as he watered his plants. The sun, timid and pale, broke through the fog outside, casting light on the apartment floor. Henry understood that life, even in its quiet despair, still had moments worth holding on to, and for the first time in months, he felt he might be ready to reach for them. Weeks passed, and Henry began to rebuild a fragile rhythm to his days. He woke each morning to water his plants, the green leaves now thriving under his care, a quiet reminder that life, even after loss, could still grow. He started preparing simple meals again, sometimes with Mrs. Alvarez's guidance, learning that nourishing himself was not just about food, but about honoring the body that had carried him this far. Phone calls from his children became more frequent, filled with laughter and stories that reminded him of the bonds he had almost let slip away. Slowly, he allowed himself to accept help with bills and errands, realizing that pride had long kept him isolated, but connection could be healing. Henry also began attending a small community group at a local library, where seniors shared memories, played cards, and offered each other companionship. At first, he was hesitant, unsure if he belonged, but the warmth of the group welcomed him. The laughter, the shared stories, the simple gestures of kindness, each one chipped away at the walls of isolation he had built. He still felt grief, still missed Margaret every day, and still experienced moments of despair. But now, those feelings existed alongside hope, support, and small victories. The world hadn't changed, but Henry had begun to change his place in it. He realized that recovery didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to live fully despite loss, finding light even in the shadows. Each day was still a challenge, but Henry faced it with a quiet determination. His steps were slower, his body weaker, yet his heart, once heavy with despair, began to feel lighter, buoyed by connection, routine, and the gentle rhythm of life returning. One quiet evening, Henry sat by the window again, the city lights of Portland twinkling like distant stars. The fog had lifted, leaving a gentle clarity in the air. He held a cup of tea in his hands, warm and comforting, and for the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace that wasn't fleeting or fragile. Henry thought of Margaret, of the life they had shared, the laughter, the love, and even the quiet sorrows. Though she was gone, her memory no longer crushed him. Instead, it reminded him of the capacity of the human heart to endure, to grieve, and to find meaning in what remains. He realized that grief was not a river to cross, but a companion to walk alongside, shaping him, teaching him, and deepening his understanding of life. He glanced around his apartment, plants thriving, photographs smiling back at him, letters from his children on the table. Each small detail was a testament to resilience, to connection, to hope. The loneliness had not vanished entirely, but it no longer defined him. Henry leaned back in his chair, letting the gentle hum of the city seep into his bones. Life, he understood, was not about avoiding pain, but embracing the small moments that make it bearable. A kind gesture from a neighbor, a phone call from a loved one, the warmth of a sunbeam on a foggy morning. As the night settled in, he whispered softly to the empty room, "I am still here. I am still alive, and that is enough." And with that quiet affirmation, Henry closed his eyes, letting the peace he had slowly cultivated wrap around him like a gentle blanket. In the heart of grief, he had discovered a simple truth: even in sorrow, life could still hold beauty, connection, and meaning.